Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks for both the warm hand and your warm presence here on such a cold evening. I was after Rachel to introduce the three of us as the de Blasio brothers. But this being Chicago, we figured that maybe that's not such a good idea. Somebody might take that seriously. But John likes it. It's nice to begin with a little bit of a lighthearted comment, and I hope to remember at the end to make another lighthearted comment maybe, but because everything else in between is not lighthearted at all. We've all been following the Syria crisis from 3 years ago when it started out as a peaceful uprising to a civil war to a regional war, and finally, I think, to a full-blown genocide. I don't know, I don't use that word lightly, but I don't know what else to call it when a government armed to the teeth is throwing everything it has at most of its population, at civilian population primarily. Yes, there are groups fighting the government now, and that's primarily due to the way the government dealt with the unarmed protesters at the beginning, 3 years ago. The UN has stopped counting dead bodies at 120,000. And it's partly because it's not an easy task when you're not on the ground and high-rise buildings are falling to count how many are dying. So, and partly, I'm sure, because it's macabre after a certain number to keep counting. By my own estimate, I think we're probably at 150,000 dead right now. By way of comparison, it took the Lebanese 15 years of bloody civil war to get to that number of dead people. It's taken Bashar al-Assad's killing machine 3 years. Now, not just my estimate, but many other analysts who look at this project that if nothing happens, no superpower intervenes to do something serious about stopping this war, it could easily go on for another 10 years. So take this 150,000 and multiply it, and you do the math. And tell me, is this genocide or this is not genocide? Now, I am stunned personally, and I'm tired of writing about the US national interest. I started 3 years ago in government and now out of government, saying it is in the US national interest to do something in Syria. I put aside the humanitarian argument because you can't convince people to do the right thing, but you can convince them to do what is in their interest to do. Well, apparently I failed and others have failed on both counts. But the humanitarian one, it gets to a point where you can't ignore it anymore. I mean, what does it say about us when we have seen, and we've looked at the Holocaust, we've studied the Holocaust, there are all kinds of programs to make sure this doesn't happen again. You have 9/11, and all of us remember it, where 2 buildings dropped to the ground, to rubble, and 3,000 people die. Imagine if what happened in 9/11 is happening every day, not just that once. It happened once in the US, and none of us can forget it. These barrel bombs that are being dropped by the Syrian government on high-rise buildings in Homs right now and other places in Syria. Imagine if you're sitting here in Chicago, in our nice high-rise buildings, these barrel bombs are dropping on them every day, every day. This is what the citizens of Syria are living through. What kind of a world do we live in that the world doesn't fall over itself to stop this massacre from continuing? I think I've said enough, but I need to get this off my chest. And I hope this stimulates the discussion here. And one thing that I would like to start with, Danny, is when something is in the national interest to be done. And it is doable without a huge investment. And by the way, it is the right thing to do. And it still doesn't get done. What is the problem?
This is exactly why our book, Nabeel, is titled The Syria Dilemma, because we do not see a very clear-cut, black and white answer to the nightmare. And it really is a nightmare along the lines you've just described. We're talking about suffering on such a mass scale in Syria that's only getting worse. One of the ironies of the impasse at the end of August and early September in the aftermath of the chemical weapons attack, the proposed US strike on Syria in response to that attack, and then the Russian deal to solve this problem. One of the ironies is that Assad actually emerged much stronger from that, what seemed like a crisis. He has emerged as a much more formidable player on the geopolitical stage. The killing has actually increased. The violence has deepened since late August, early September, with no end in sight. We're now in a situation where I would only add to the list that you shared this mass starvation going on in Syria. The United Nations is now estimating that possibly as many as 800,000 Syrians are currently living in these starvation sieges, that is to say, these besieged areas of the country where they're trapped. Humanitarian aid workers cannot get in to deliver food and medicine that are vitally needed. People are on the brink of starvation. Children are dying of malnutrition. Bodies are emaciated. People are literally eating grass, weeds, and roots. The New York Times today quoted one gentleman I believe in Muadamia, or one of the besieged areas, as saying that on a good day, we might have a few olives or a spoonful of bulgur. Many people have already died under these sieges, starved to death, but as many as 800,000 could be on the brink of starvation. They can't get out, and humanitarian aid workers can't get in with food and medicine. In addition to the starvation, you have the outbreak of polio. After polio was essentially eradicated, now you have the outbreak of polio. The Pakistani journalist Ahmed Rashid argues that the outbreak of polio in Syria really shames the civilized world. What is happening? And so, what is to be done? These areas are besieged, they're surrounded, mostly by Assad's forces, in some cases by extremist militias. Now, my own view is that we might not be able, after 3 years of this geopolitical go-around, after negotiations, now 2 rounds of negotiations and a new one starting yesterday, we don't have an answer, we don't have a solution to the Syrian crisis at large, but if you could just break off one piece of it, which is what our op-ed that will be out in tomorrow morning's New York Times tries to do, if you could just look at this one crisis where Syrian civilians, these are unarmed, non-combatants, and they are dying, they're starving to death, what can be done to get food and medicine into those people?
The big news was that the first buses that left had 80 people on them, and then the next ones had maybe 200 to 300 that were being let out. But this is from several thousand. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? This is the worst part in a way because of the starvation and the way these people are under siege. But again, UN figures estimate 6 million internally displaced persons. And these people are living sometimes in other areas, sometimes under shelter, sometimes just out in the open. And that's the bigger problem